Welcome to AFSPA Talks, a production of the American Foreign Service Protective Association with Chief Operating Officer Kyle Longton. Be sure to subscribe to us on your favorite podcast channel. Enjoy the episode.
Welcome to another episode of AFSPA Talks. I'm Kyle Longton, and along with me, as always, is
Hannah Wolfart.
And today we're celebrating Pride Month. It's June, which means it is Pride Month everywhere. We may not see the usual Pride activities everywhere that we are used to seeing maybe back to 2019, but we're seeing some adaptations both here in DC and around the world. But Hannah, when we talked about this episode, you offered to talk a little bit, share some personal information. Would you like to start there?
Yeah, definitely. So I identify as part of the LGBTQ plus community, and I'm happy to share some of my own thoughts and experiences with our listeners before we jump on into this episode and talk to an expert.
I appreciate that. And thank you for trusting us, myself and the listeners, to share that and to share your experiences. So Hannah, we're talking about LGBTQ youth in today's episode and some of the challenges they might face, or some of the ways that they some of the things they might experience as they go through the process of identifying. Can you talk a little bit about maybe at what age you started identifying as part of this community?
Yeah, definitely. When I was a young teenager, I started to identify in this community, not to my family, but to a few friends at first. And it was a slow process for me, but it was a difficult one because I didn't feel completely comfortable coming out because of just the stigma surrounding it in society, and even some sort of biases in my own family that I was nervous to approach and have to deal with. And so I was grateful that the friends that I did come out to accepted me and created a welcoming environment for me. I'm very grateful to have had that experience. But it wasn't the same experience when I came out to my family, Kyle. It was harder than that, more difficult. There was not acceptance right away. And so I wish that I had resources to go to for help, just on how to navigate that and the challenges that come with that.
How did you deal with that? Did you seek, behavioral health, mental health treatment, counseling from a professional? Did your family perhaps do the same to figure out how to support you?
So my family did not do that, but I definitely did. And I was able to find a therapist to talk to who was, comfortable discussing LGBTQ plus topics. And I'm still with that therapist today. And so she kind of guided me through my high school experience, if you will, and then my college experience as well, because it was a whole new set of people to come out to and kind of start the process all over again.
And I've heard others say before that, in some ways you're coming out every day as you meet new people.
Yes, definitely.
Has that become easier over time?
Yes, 100%. I think in the beginning, like when I was in high school, I was very hesitant to come out to people. I wouldn't have just told anybody. If I was in this position, I wouldn't have said, to you, oh, by the way, I'm in this community and I'm comfortable speaking about it. It was kind of a sign to me when we brought up the idea of this podcast topic that I had, grown a lot in that sense, because I was, very willing to just say, hey, Kyle, by the way, I am a part of this community and I'd love to speak on it.
And I think my reaction was we'll talk about this if you want to. We can talk about this in whatever way you want to. And so I think that there are still some biases out there. And I just want to make sure that you are in a comfortable place. And I'm glad that you are. And it sounds like it is easier. And I, again, appreciate that trust. And I'm glad that we're exploring this topic because I think there are probably I know there are people out there younger than you in the same situation that it sounds like you were in your early teens, who are not sure what to do or whose parents aren't sure how to react. And I'm hoping that our discussion today and you're sharing your own experience can help them.
Definitely. And thank you for creating a safe space for me to share my experience and for others listening to, feel comfortable with their experiences as well from this.
we're all part of the same community. We've got sub communities within that, but we're all part of an AFSPA family here. And so I appreciate you, helping take the lead on crafting this episode as well. I also want to say thank you to GLIFA, the LGBTQ plus group at the State Department and other foreign affairs agencies, and their president, Jeffrey Anderson, who first suggested this topic, and for their partnership and their advocacy on behalf of their members. So Hannah, thank you very much. I think we've got a great guest who works a lot with LGBTQ youth and also with their families in some ways. And I hope that I learn a lot in this episode. I hope that you hear some things that are helpful now, and that our listeners hear some things that are helpful, or that you may have learned already and would have been helpful to have that experience previously. So I'll take a moment, if I may, and I'll introduce Alyssa Clayden. She's a licensed independent social worker who's provided international mental health services for more than 2 decades in a wide variety of settings. She's lived, worked, and raised a family across 5 continents, and she's passionate about providing high-quality, individualized mental health services to expats. She believes that every person brings expertise, strength, and skills to their lives and relationships, and she views collaboration and space for humor as key components of any successful mental health work. Currently, Alyssa is researching transcultural elements that impact mental health factors, such as intergenerational, personal, and collective traumas and events, in pursuit of her PhD. We connected with Alyssa through our longstanding relationship with the Truman Group, and she's one of their providers. When we spoke prior to this episode, she shared with me that around half of her clients are young people who identify as LGBTQIA or somewhere else on the sexual attraction spectrum or gender identity spectrum. So welcome, Alyssa Clayden. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of AFSPA Talks. And today we're talking about issues facing LGBTQ plus youth.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. And of course, we're doing this in conjunction with Pride Month, but this is an issue that is an everyday issue. And so as a starting place, I want to make sure that our listeners understand the terms that we may be using our discussion, how we're talking about the community that you serve in a big way. So can you walk us through what we mean when we say LGBTQIA, if there are other terms we should be using that might be more inclusive?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to start with the word queer because that's the language that you'll hear me use the most often today.
Okay.
And just to kind of address the trajectory that queer has been on. So, historically, the word queer has been used very much as an epithet to demean folks that are, existing across the sexual attraction and gender spectrums. And so at some point within those communities, many people made the decision to actually reclaim that language. And so for me, when the language of queer was really becoming very common, when I was in my teens, it also was very directly connected to like advocacy and activism and focusing on equity. And so depending on kind of when you were coming of age into the community and when you and how you identify now, queer can be something that feels very empowering and very connecting and also very inclusive, right? As a word, it often is used to be more broadly inclusive as a community than something like LGBTQIA+, because it just allows for all of the difference that might exist. But there are absolutely, I want to make sure and emphasize, there are absolutely people who don't like the language of queer and they choose not to use it, and that's absolutely okay. So within that language, LGBTQIA, so the letters themselves stand for different communities, right? So L is lesbian, G is gay, B is bisexual, T is transgender, and using that definition of transgender as a person who's assigned sex and their gender don't match. Q usually means queer, but it can also mean questioning. So it depends on kind of who you ask. I is intersex. And A is asexual, which is someone who experiences little to no sexual attraction or has sexual attraction under very limited circumstances.
Okay. And you mentioned before, and you used this in a conversation we had recently, the sexual attraction spectrum and the gender identity spectrum, and those, along with your explanation now of the term queer, strike me as very inclusive terms, or at least more inclusive than a specific letter, LGBTQIA, that as you mentioned before. So and it's allowing some nuance to exist for so many. And I don't want to ask for numbers, because I don't think that there are. I don't think the numbers are out there, and I think that there are more people, and particularly youth, based on your experience and practice, who identify on these spectrums. Is that right? Are you finding that it's more common than people might think?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, one of the things that's been really incredible about the changes with young people being really open and really discussing these ideas is that I'm seeing actually in older populations as well, then they're starting to say, oh, some of this makes sense to me. Like, I do have this kind of attraction, but I never thought of myself as anything other than straight, or, those kinds of things. So it's really been an interesting shift that I think is actually opening all individuals up to this idea that humans don't simply exist as this or that, right? That there could be kind of these layers and nuances. Yeah.
That is very interesting. That sort of as younger generations have gotten more comfortable with it, older generations and just society perhaps more generally talking about these issues, being more open about it, have identified themselves as fitting somewhere on that spectrum, other than at one complete opposite end.
Yes, absolutely.
Extreme end, I should say. Yeah. I'd like to talk a little bit about what you see in your practice, particularly when you're working with youth. Clinically speaking, what are the diagnoses that you encounter?
So for young people who are identifying or think that they may be identifying within the queer community, we really often kind of right at the beginning, when I'm talking to folks, we often are looking at something like an adjustment disorder as they're trying to kind of manage what it is that they're experiencing. But it can impact them in ways like depression is often a really common diagnosis. Anxiety is a huge diagnosis across both attraction spectrum and gender identity spectrums. And then we see some trauma. So sometimes for folks who are living within the queer community, whether it's their own, sometimes their access to representation and ideas that fit with what they're experiencing internally is very, very minimal, right? So even today, I would argue representation is much better than it was even 10, 20 years ago. But for a lot of young people, if they aren't able to get access to that representation, if they don't know that's there, they sometimes have some trauma that's related to that. And so we do sometimes have some PTSD diagnoses that are also connected. The most common for those on the gender spectrum is a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And I feel like people kind of toss this around, but I'm not sure if people know what it is. So just to kind of define it, the idea of gender dysphoria is that a person's body and their gender don't match. And what that does is that creates some really intense and exhausting mental distress.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I think about dysphoria, it's really all of the uncomfortable or difficult emotions that folks can feel that are connected to their appearance, sometimes very specifically to their body, or to how people experience them externally. So they might feel okay with their body, but when they're out, maybe they're being misgendered by other people, or they're being criticized, or aren't able to dress in a way that fits with how they want to be seen. So there are kind of these different planes in which dysphoria can impact them. And there's actually an additional component that's just really recently been being researched called non-binary dysphoria. So you have folks who identify as non-binary, not male, not female. They're outside of that very specific binary. And so what that means is that for folks with non-binary dysphoria, often there's a sense that they're supposed to be like choosing a side, or they're supposed to be figuring out something that fits those established binary genders. And so sometimes they really struggle with this idea of, am I even real? Or some people might even identify with like non-human characters or bodies, because that feels more like how they feel internally. So there are all these different ways that they kind of experience the body and the way that the outside world interprets their body.
Interesting. And you mentioned a little bit, you referred to it before in terms of representation, that there's more representation that we're seeing maybe in the culture, and but and sometimes that is maybe representation of, in a previous conversation we talked about representation of a gay character or a lesbian character, but we don't necessarily see as many transgender characters or asexual characters and so forth, and it can be challenging for youth to find those representations to identify. Is that something that you have found ongoing in your clinical practice, and how do you approach that?
Yes. So something that's been really incredible to watch over the years is as gay and lesbian characters have become more consistent in broader cultural media, and in just like standard discourse in terms of what families look like. Some of the folks in those communities have actually found a little bit stronger footing, which has been really great to see. And it's opened the opportunity then for some of these other communities to have a little bit of a spotlight and to ask for their own representation, which is great. What I have found is that when young people that I work with identify with a community, such as something like asexual or aromantic, and they try to describe that to others, the lack of knowledge and understanding that others have, even if they're accepting of it, is really distressing for them. And it's very hard for them to find a way to engage with their own identity because they don't have anything to kind of compare it to or connect it to.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's often a lot of self-doubt and a lot of heavy concern that they're never going to find who they are, right? That they know that this word is there, they know that this definition is there, but they just can't find others that they can relate to. They feel like there's no community. Mm-hmm. And like I mentioned at the beginning, within the queer community, a lot of this language is specifically about building community, like finding folks who have those similar experiences or needs or processes, right? And so what I have found is that using contemporary literature, using online forums, there are things that exist. There are some incredible authors out there that are putting out really great, really well-written, very representative and normalizing sexual attraction and gender identity spectrum literature. And so those are kind of the things that when I work with young people, I try to connect them to those pieces. I try to help them identify
Mm-hmm.
where some of that representation might be. So that even if it's limited,
Yeah.
it helps them feel a little bit less isolated.
Right. That it does exist, that
Yes.
they have a community. Yes, they exist. Right. They have a community, that what they're feeling is what they're feeling, and there's nothing wrong with it.
Yes.
To feel comfortable. That is excellent. Well, on that subject, then, as youth are going through this process of self-discovery and self-identification, well, what emotions might they be feeling, and how in your practice have you seen those feelings, those emotions manifest themselves? So, if we have parents listening, what might they observe?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one of the things that's really complicated about this is that a lot of times, it's preteens and teens, and they can be a little, at least in terms of our like social mythology, they can be a little volatile, they can be a little confusing. And so a lot of times parents, I think, assume that if their child is having strong emotions in one direction or another, or is being angry or combative, that it's just like, oh, they're just being a teenager, right? I hear that a lot. I need them to just, not be such a teenager. But what I know is that when young people are exhibiting any kind of emotion, they're trying to communicate something, right? And so we often see for young people within that queer community space, sadness and social anxiety tend to be really strong. There tends to be a lot of low self-confidence, or a sense of like, I'm not good enough. And it often manifests in all kinds of ways. Like it tends to be very visible. And so something that I find is that parents will actually see that in their young people, and they'll refer them often without the young person having disclosed their own identity needs. Parents will refer them and say, they're really focused on how they aren't getting high enough grades, or they aren't good enough to continue this sport, or to go out for the play, or to, be engaged in things that they used to really enjoy. And so that for me is often a really key factor to kind of have a conversation about what is it that's having you sit in this space where like you are not enough, where you can't do these things. And that can certainly impact non-queer teens, but I think that that's a space where parents could maybe start to have some of that conversation. There also can really be some of the ones that frighten parents are things like really drastic changes in appearance, or a really varied self-expression. So some of the young people I work with, like one day they might come out and they're dressed in what would be considered, a very feminine type of an outfit. And then the next day they're they've maybe cut their hair and they're dressed in a very more masculine type of an outfit, or maybe they're mixing and matching, right? And parents sometimes feel a little concerned. Often they're worried about what their child's peers will say. So parents often will present with that, right? We think they're being bullied. We think that, we think they will be. We're not
This
sure
could be, yeah.
Right. So those are kind of the things you're looking for. I wish that it were more concrete and I could be like, okay, here's what's happening. But I think anytime, if you notice that your young person is having some trouble moving back and forth in terms of how they present themselves, if they get you to watch a show with them that has a character that you've never heard of, right? Like a non-binary character, or this has been so interesting with streaming services. I feel like this has really increased where parents will say, like, oh, we've been watching this show and she got really mad at me when I made this comment about such and such, like, and so kind of helping parents to recognize, like, if your young person is really enjoying the show and it has a lot of queer representation, maybe they're just trying to gauge where you are and if they're able to have a conversation with you about that. Just kind of some of those, I think those are the pieces that for parents are helpful to notice and to maybe even bring it in yourself. Just noting, if you're wondering, if you're thinking it's possible that they're in that space, or they've disclosed something, even if they've disclosed it like in anger, bringing some of those shows in yourself, or finding some of those books and kind of talking about it, right? Seeing where your teen falls.
And just being open to that conversation, and or starting that conversation as a parent sounds like a great place to be.
It's a great place to be if you can. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, as we're talking about parents, in your experience, what emotions might the parents themselves be experiencing that maybe they're manifesting to their kids, or trying to work through themselves in this situation?
Yeah. So, it's so interesting because we do often think about the young person, right? So young people can be confused, they can feel alone, they can feel afraid, and we think about those diagnoses, right? Like dysphoria or depression or anxiety, but we often actually forget about what the parents are going through. And I think it's really easy to kind of fall on one side, speaking of binaries, like deciding that parents are either right or wrong in the way they're handling it, right?
Right. They just need to deal with it and adjust. Yeah.
Yeah. Either figure it out or, refuse, but just pick a side, right? And so I think one of the most important things for parents and for young people, if they can, they're in a hard spot to kind of be asked to do this, but to try and recognize that for parents, many parents have so many hopes and dreams and assumptions about what it will be like to be a parent and what their children will be like. And until their kids really get older, they don't actually face a lot of that. A lot of parents don't actually think about the fact that, they can't control a lot of those pieces of who their kid is. And so I think being able to, as parents, recognize that, it's okay if you feel a sense of loss or grief because your child didn't fit into, a more narrow definition maybe, or a definition just that you recognize, right? Or that you can relate to. A lot of times losing that relatable experience, like of what it is to grow up as a teen girl or a teen boy who's cisgendered, that can feel like a big loss. Like I was supposed to go through this with you and now I'm completely out of my depth. I don't know what to do as a parent. Or there can also be this sense that parents like that they're not allowed to be angry about it, right? That, and I mean, if you're talking about grief, one of the stages of grief is anger, right? That it's okay to kind of have that space. I would argue, if possible, if you're angry, not directing that toward your young person, right? But finding a space where you can actually allow yourself to feel that and recognize that there is a loss there. And that doesn't demean or diminish who your child is. And it doesn't mean you can't be a fantastic support for them. It just means you've got to work through that on your own. And that's absolutely fine.
And I think that's an important point. I mentioned to you that we have seen examples of whole families, youth who identifies on the gender identity or on the sexual attraction spectrum, maybe both parents and even siblings who have sought counseling when a young family member is learning about themselves. Have you seen examples of like this in your own practice, of family reactions, and have those changed over the years?
Yes, absolutely. So I love the idea, and I would encourage any family with a young person identifying in the queer community to have everybody at least do self-education. But I love the idea of family therapy or individual therapies where you can kind of work through your own ideas and assumptions and kind of move into a space that feels better for everybody. So that's wonderful. And that's very different from when I very first started doing this work. Initially, young people would be referred and it would be like, this is their issue. This is on them. Like, I don't want to know about it. We're not going to do family. Even in families that were really supportive, a lot of times it was like, oh, but it's them, right? It's not us. And in recent years, just the last, I'd say maybe 3 or 4, not very many, it's been much more consistent that parents, that siblings will be saying, I want to better understand this. I want our family to incorporate this into who we are as a family. I do think there's also some anxiety and maybe fear even on the part of parents in terms of, what does this look like, right? Like, how do I keep my child safe? How do I not end up misgendering or causing them more distress or more trauma? So I think also parents are more interested in, how do my actions actually impact my child, and how do I kind of move past some of that terror that sometimes, makes me think, oh, I don't want to talk about it, or I'll just nod, but I'm not sure what we're doing in this moment. So I do think there's that too. I think there's a willingness to address that fear now, rather than kind of sit behind it and just hope everything turns out okay.
That is great, and sort of facing it head on, and then seeking not only self-education at the very least, but perhaps their own counseling support system to have that place to express their own emotions. So it's not being directed at a family member. There's a healthy place to work through it. That's excellent. You have worked specifically with our membership a lot, with youth in the Foreign Service Benefit Plan, and you are familiar with some of the unique challenges our members face from your own experience living and working overseas, but also through your clinical work. We have members who move every few years. We have members who may be living overseas for decades. Their whole childhood and youth is overseas. But do you have any special advice for our members, particularly those who may be going overseas or spending the majority of their time overseas?
Yes. So it's such a unique population, right? For a lot of young folks, they have the opportunity to build community where they're established. And when young folks are moving consistently, that can be really difficult. One of the things that comes up a lot is parents will often ask me if it's safe for their queer child to be on the internet as much as they are, or to be, or will even ask directly, like, do you think my child, for example, identifies as trans or identifies as non-binary or as pansexual because they're on the internet, right? Do you think that this is coming from internet influence, and should we limit that? And so one of the things that I often recommend for parents is to actually allow that online connection, because of that consistent movement for young folks and families in the foreign service, it's really difficult for young folks to build community when they aren't staying in the same places. And so I know that parents have a lot of anxiety about that and kind of what is the internet offering. And there certainly can be concerns with it. There certainly can be forums that are, validating unsafe behaviors and things like that. But I do think it's important that young people, they can get access to so much information and groups. I often will refer my queer clients to like online group therapy forums or places where they can have that connection through through agencies that I trust or that I feel like are making good choices in terms of safety, right? But, I think that that's a really positive peer support that they can access that they simply cannot access if they're moving every couple of years to a new school. Some kids get really lucky and they have friends who are within the queer community in the spaces where they land. But that can then often make the next move really difficult because they don't know what's coming next and they don't know if they'll have that support. The other thing,
no, I would just say, once again, I'm hearing you talk about the importance of youth in particular in the queer community, being able to see that the community exists, that they are real, that there are others like them, that they are not alone. And allowing for that in a safe way, and that there are safe forums for that out there, and parental, as with any internet activity, yes, parental monitoring is good, but giving kids and youth space to explore that and to connect with others is very healthy. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's so important. The other thing that I know comes up specifically for foreign service folks is depending on where you are living, this can be a really messy, complicated way of living, right? So there are countries where any form of the queer community is not only not recognized, but their existence is actually, against the law, or any behaviors related to that are against the law. There are places, I work with young folks in some countries who are afraid to be outside, who are afraid to correct someone if they're misgendered, because they know that violence against them will not be sanctioned in any way, right? They are not safe in those ways. And so I think something else to consider as a parent of a queer youth is, if you have ways to help them be safer in those spaces, to help them understand, from country to country, kind of what that looks like. Even, sometimes young people that I've worked with, they might be out in a place where they're living, and the next place they go to, they make the decision to not be. And the whole family often gets in on that decision. And we have a conversation about, how do we make sure that as a family, you're remembering that this is who your child is presenting as on arrival, and that's who you maintain, that they are, helping parents with things like dead naming, accidental dead naming, or misgendering, or things like that. So those are important pieces that I think sometimes parents don't think as much about if they themselves are not part of the queer community, because the level of anxiety and the possibility of danger in some places is just so incredibly high. But if you aren't worried about that, right, it's really hard to actually notice how intense of a feeling that can be, and how hard it can be to just step outside of your house.
Yeah. And I just want to add here that for any foreign service families who are listening and who might have concerns about the adequacy of medical treatment or access to treatment options overseas, particularly for treatment of gender dysphoria, I would encourage you to contact the Bureau of Medical Services to have that conversation. They are plugged into this. They've gone through it with other families. So make sure you go to the right source for that conversation, any concerns you might have. So, Alyssa, this has been a fantastic conversation, enlightening in so many ways, but also just reaffirming of the support and the communities that exist out there for youth, and providing youth and children space to be who they are and to find out who they are. And I just want to, is there anything else you'd like to add? Anything that you feel like we've missed in our discussion for our listeners?
I think maybe one of the things that that might be useful just to name is that for parents in particular, there isn't like a right or a wrong way to do this. And I think a lot of times parents feel like either they know what to do or they don't. But there are so many ways to walk through this with your child. I think the biggest pieces are allowing your youth to tell you what that self-identification is, and to have them help you with the language that they're using, and to just be okay with that, right? That it doesn't have to be a term that you recognize or that you're comfortable with, and you don't need to worry about if it's going to change. I do know something that comes up because language is so fluid within the queer community, and because young people are in that process, right? So they tend to go kind of back and forth, or am I this, am I that, does this make sense? And we want them to do that, right? We want them to find the identities that fit best. And I think sometimes parents think that means that either it's not real or it's not going to stick around,
Just
or
a phase.
Yeah, just a phase, right? So I think just parents allowing yourselves to just kind of take a breath, recognize it's a process, and that it's a really fantastic opportunity for your kid to know themselves really well, and for you to get to know them really well on their terms.
And I think just on that, because I've heard people say before, oh, they're too young to know that. And I think that goes along with what you're saying here. I'm just curious, where are you seeing in your practice children and youth starting to explore their identity, whether it's gender or sexual attraction? Where are you? At what age are you starting to see that, and those questions starting to come up?
Yeah, so I have worked with young folks at ages, as low as maybe 7 or 8, kind of talking about, I know that this is different. It doesn't fit with what everyone else is saying or with what other people are doing. And you're absolutely right. Often parents will say, well, they don't know, or it's too soon, and I absolutely understand that instinct to sort of default to that. What I know is that when I sit with a 7-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old, and they talk to me about these pieces, they know what does and doesn't fit. They know what it feels like internally to not understand why other people aren't the same. They are trying to figure out what that language is. And that's actually been a really great positive in the last few years as well. Some of this language in terms of the gender identity spectrum and the attraction spectrums, some of that language is filtering in, right? It is getting into schools, it is getting into conversations, it's in media. And so an incredible change that I've seen is that young people, as young as 7, 8, 9, 10, can say, I heard about this term, pansexual, or I heard about this term transgender, and I think maybe it makes sense to me. And here's why I think maybe it makes sense to me. And can you help me understand if I'm understanding that term correctly? And so they have that language, I think, which, easily a decade ago, young people did not have that language. And so they were instead presenting with, I don't seem to make sense the way other people make sense, and I don't know why, right? And so it was a more laborious process in some ways. But I absolutely think that kids at that age, when they're expressing doubt and uncertainty, they know what they're talking about. What that looks like at the far end of finding their identity, we don't know, but we know that they are asking those questions, and that it's important to them to ask those questions, which then I would argue makes it important to us to listen to those questions and help them try to move through to find answers.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for the work you do with our membership and the one-on-one and family basis, but it also thank you for joining us today and sharing your experience and your expertise.
Absolutely. It's so great to be here. I'm so pleased that you are prioritizing queer youth.
Absolutely. There are members too, and a big important part. So thanks again, Alyssa.
Absolutely. Take care.
You too. Thanks again to Alyssa Clayden for joining us today. For more information on coverage of mental and behavioral health services, as well as gender-affirming treatment available under the Foreign Service Benefit Plan, please refer to the 2021 brochure or to our website at afspa.org/FSBP, or give us a call at 202-833-4910. Thanks for joining us for this episode of AFSPA Talks, a production of the American Foreign Service Protective Association. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show, and tell your friends about it. We welcome your feedback on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Look for @AFSPA Cares. All information offered in this podcast is meant to be educational. Comments offered by the hosts or guests are not intended as medical advice. Please direct questions about your personal health needs to a provider. Should there be any discrepancy between information offered in this podcast and official plan documents for the Foreign Service Benefit Plan or other products offered by AFSPA, the policy provisions will prevail. Special thanks as always to Hannah Wolfhart for producing, editing, and mixing this episode. We'll see you next time.